Well, Michelle Grattan, good morning.
Good morning.
We have state elections this weekend in Tasmania and South Australia. Both are tipped to go to the Liberals, which would leave the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, as the only Labor-led government in Australia. If that all comes to pass, what do you think it'll mean federally?
Certainly Tony Abbott is looking forward to having an all-blue country when it comes to federal-state relations. I think that the ACT would be regarded as only a small glitch from the national point of view. But of course, you don't automatically get cooperation from state governments of the same hue. It's a good start for him, but as we saw in Labor's time, when Kevin Rudd was trying to get a hospitals agreement, the Victorian Labor government of the day was quite difficult. So it'll be interesting to see how it all does work out. You do have, of course, some quite distinct characters at the state level, notably Campbell Newman in Queensland, and Queenslanders and indeed people from WA, governments from WA, are always very distinctive and outspoken in their views. So Tony Abbott could find some complications down the track.
Well, you mentioned WA. That's topical because campaigning has begun in earnest for the Senate election there. Clive Palmer, I think, has pinned hopes on winning a seat there. How do you think that's looking?
I think it's too early to tell, and it'll probably be quite difficult to tell at any stage because a Senate election's not quite like a House election for polling. It's much more complicated, of course, with the preference flow, and there's talk of Clive Palmer trying to do deals with small parties to sweep up their preferences. I was talking to him the other day. He thinks that at the moment they're running at about a bit over a quota. Now maybe that's talking up his book, but nevertheless it's quite possible that he could poll quite well, but also it's possible that Western Australian voters will think, well, we saw what happened with micro parties in the general election. We want to keep away from that. It'll be significant too, I think, what happens in Tasmania, because Clive Palmer has been working very hard there, spending a lot of money there in terms of TV advertising and print. If he does well in Tasmania, then there'll be a lot of hype around that, and that could help him in Western Australia. If he flops somewhat in Tasmania, well, then maybe the balloon bursts for Western Australia.
I mean, is it possible in the Western Australian Senate election that the prospect of an all-blue Australia might persuade some people not to vote Liberal?
I think it's really hard to judge on that. I think that that's a sort of fairly complicated concept for a Senate election. The big issues in the West, I think, will be Tony Abbott's argument. We have a mandate to repeal the carbon tax, the mining tax. These are taxes that resonate particularly in WA, and they haven't been repealed. So that's his side. On the other side, Labor is trying to make mileage out of the problems of the local state government, the Barnett government, and say, look, you see all the difficulties with health, education, so on here. Tony Abbott will replicate those.
So turning away from electoral politics, Martin Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary, it's reported this week that John Howard and Peter Costello advised Tony Abbott that they should keep Martin Parkinson in the role. But it's reported also this week that Tony Abbott has decided that he won't. What does this say about the current government if all of this is true?
Well, it was a bit surprising that last September it was announced that 2 or 3 secretaries would be going, they were axed, and Martin Parkinson was put in a sort of limbo situation. He was due to go mid this year. In other words, he was sacked, but it was a delayed sacking. Now, he would like to stay on to the end of the G20 in November, but also there are some around the government, notably his Minister Joe Hockey, who would really like to keep him forever because they're getting on well. It's a difficult economic time. To bring in a new person now seems quite counterproductive, really, not very efficient if you like to look at it in echo terms. But it does seem that the Abbott office is fairly adamant that he should go. I think it is quite unfair and unreasonable, really, but it's a bit of an example of the tribalism we're seeing fairly broadly from this government. I think the feeling is they feel he was associated particularly with the climate change push of Labor because he headed the climate department, and that seems to me the root of his troubles. Also, the coalition last year thought that the Labor government had politicised Treasury, and all these things have just been taken out on Martin Parkinson, who is a very good economist and a very respected long-term senior public servant.
Well, turning finally to one other issue of the day, the government says that it's going to rework or amend the Racial Discrimination Act, which caught Conservative commentator Andrew Bolt, but seems to be running into trouble with its proposals from different constituencies. How do you see things?
There's no doubt that the Bolt judgment did drive the desire to amend this Act. Whether the government would go completely to repeal is much less certain because it talks about repeal in its current form, so it keeps qualifying it in that way. But certainly it wants to drastically change the Act. Now, what's happened is ethnic communities across the country and also the Jewish lobby are getting very agitated about this. They don't want the Act to go, or this section of the Act, I should say, to go. They don't even want it to be fiddled with, and George Brandis is caught in the middle. He's caught between the free speech Bolt lobby and the counter-lobbying of those who say, well, it's only been this one judgment that's been a problem, and to do something drastic is really not worth the effort and could be quite counterproductive.
Yeah, I wonder why the government is getting itself into these scrapes or difficult issues. It's hardly the main game in the first term of office.
Well, you would have thought so, and again we see the tribalism factor. I think if Andrew Bolt had not had this, if it hadn't been Andrew Bolt, then I don't think that the government would be going to all this trouble, frankly.
Well, Michelle Grattan, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.